are saying it's the age of Coleridge and Wordsworth. Romantic age, because in this age there were natural feeling of poets. Okay, connection with nature was there. That is the reason we say it is a romantic age. This age of art, literature, and music. So romanticism is not only limited to literature but art and music as well. Advancement of arts and music. Wordsworth was the famous romantic poet of this age. Yes, Wordsworth was the famous romantic age poet of this age. And then another literary name of this romantic age is the age of Wordsworth. Okay, so that is a very good response from you. Okay, now coming to uh, those slides there. Okay. Okay, the very first we'll be discussing the introduction or the background of this romantic age. Okay, I'll be in a way giving lecture to you. I'll be discussing things with you. When I ask a question, okay, you must be attentive there. You must reply me in chat. Please do not open your mic. Reply me through chat there. Okay, if I ask any question from you. Okay, the very first thing is a background of this romantic age. Why there was emergence of this romantic age or the movement of romanticism. Romantic age is in a way connected with movement, that is romanticism. Similarly, like classical age or neoclassical or Augustan age is connected with a movement, that is neoclassicism. Similarly, like Greek period is connected with a movement, that is classicism. Classicism is connected with the Greek period. Neoclassicism is connected with 18th century Augustan period. Similarly, Romanticism is connected with Romantic age. That in a way, the time limit or the period in which this age was is mostly authors say it is in between 1798 to 1832, but that is still not agreed upon. Okay, we'll be discussing why it is not agreed upon that. But usually the dominant or the most talked dates of romantic age are between years are 1798 to 1832. Uh, so there was, we discussed the characteristics of 18th century. If you remember, those characteristics of 18th century prose are generally the characteristics of 18th century literature. We discussed that there was a dry intellectuality. The neoclassical writers like Dryden, Pope, and then Johnson, they were copying those classical masters, and then they were not able to exactly copy those classical masters, those Greek and Roman classical masters. That was a reason they tried to copy them, but they were not successful. That is the reason we say these writers are pseudo classical. They try to be like classical, but they are not classical. They are pseudo classical or neoclassical. So they focused on dry intellectuality. Like Greek writers, they focused on philosophy, intellectual awareness in their works. Okay, and then all the things which are related to high moral ground. So Greek writers focus on those things, and then 18th century writers tried to copy them. So that resulted in dry intellectuality. Though the intellectuality of Elizabethan writers and then the Greek writers was not dry, that was pure intellectuality. Okay, but they resulted, but they copied their intellectuality, their philosophical behaviors, their works, but they were unsuccessful. That is the reason we say in 18th century we find dry intellectuality. Okay, so dry intellectuality and strict adherence to the rules was the dominating feature of 18th century. 18th century writers focused on strict adherence of the rule. They said if you have to write a work, you must write it in a way heroic couplet. You can't write that in blank verse. You can't write that in a free verse. You can't avoid those rules. There must be rules to write. If someone wants to be a writer, he must be a philosopher with him, with being a writer here. A philosopher can only be a writer if he's an intellectual, if he knows rules of poetry and then the prose, if he knows rules of meter and then if he knows rules of grammar, only then he can be a writer. Otherwise, he cannot be. So there was a strict limitations, there was strict rules which were to be followed in neoclassical 18th century. So that was in a way background, that is there in the background of romantic age. Romantic age starts in 1798. The entire age 18th century before 1798 was dominated by dry intellectuality and strict adherence to the rules there. So this movement began in the background of those dry intellectuality and strict adherence of the rules there. In addition to it, okay, we saw it is an age of a revolution there. American Revolution in 1786, 1776, I guess. America got independence in 1776. We know it as an American Revolution, and then a French Revolution, especially. Okay, that was near to Britain. Britain is a part of European continent, and then the French Revolution took place in European continent as well. But American Revolution was in a way there across the Atlantic. So that has a little influence. Most of influence was coming from that continent Europe, from that France there. So that was an age of revolution. We see French Revolution in 17, American Revolution in 1776, and then French Revolution in 1789 there. So this inspired writers to revolt in their field, literature as well. So when then writers saw that in political grounds, in politics, uh, those masses, those common people have revolted against those traditional classical rules, traditional kings there. They want freedom. They want their own authority. They want to do something at their own. They do not want to follow the kings there. And then those clergy there. So they saw the revolution in America, in France. They were inspired by those political revolution, and then they try to do that revolution in literature as well. That was a reason they revolted against that dry intellectuality of those Greek masters, of those in a way 18th century neoclassical, pseudo-classical writers who focused on strict adherence of the rules. They said these are the few 3, 4, 5, 6 rules. You can't go away from these rules. You have to follow these rules. These rules are derived by ancient Greek and Roman masters. You can't write it your own. You can't make rules of your own. You have to always follow the made rules which are being followed since centuries there. Okay, so that was a bondage there for the writers in literature. Similarly, there was a bondage there for people there in politics. Okay, in the society, they had to follow the kings. They had to follow the clergy. They revolted against that kings and clergy. Similarly, inspired by those things, the writers in literature, they revolted against that dry intellectuality, that bondage, that rules of those Greek and Roman masters there, and then those neoclassical writers. So this is how there is a connection between French Revolution and Romanticism. When you will see Romanticism, most of time is always considered synonym to revolution, because Romanticism was revolution to classism, as French Revolution was revolution or revolt against the kings and clergy, and then those old traditional rules. Similarly, French Revolution, like French Revolution, we have in our literature, there is a revolution in the same time period. That is a romantic revolution. So Romanticism is always connected with revolution. Okay, that is a very important thing to keep in your mind. When you will be discussing things, and when you will be reading things in detail, you will see romantic movement or romanticism is always connected with revolution, because it emerged in response, in reaction. It was not original movement. It did not emerge in isolation. It emerged as a result of 18th century dry intellectuality and strict adherence to rule. Those pseudo-classical writers, like French Revolution and American Revolution, was a revolt, was a revolution French romanticism was also a revolt or a revolution. Okay, so people were infuriated upon formality and gaudiness of pseudo-classicism of 18th century, as we discussed there. Therefore, they brought this romantic revolution. Romanticism, in a way, was revolt against that neoclassical and Augustan school of thought there. Neoclassical or Augustan school of thought. Okay, so that is something we discussed there. Okay, coming to the second slide there. Okay, there is a one writer. His name is in a way. Uh, his name is Jeffrey, Lord Jeffrey. Okay, he makes a point there. He says he opposes that romantic revolution. He opposes that in a way revolt against the classical rules of those Greek and Roman masters. What he says, Lord Jeffrey says, poetry has this much common with religion. Poetry has this much common with religion. See, religion can't be questioned. Religion can't be changed. It will remain same through ages there. We can't change that religion. Okay, it is something fixed. It is something immovable. Similarly, he says poetry or literature. Okay, the rules of that poetry and literature, they are fixed like religion. They can't be changed. They have been made by those Greek and Roman masters, our Elizabethan ancestors. We can't change those rules. That it is standard was fixed long ago, he says. The standard, okay, of those rules were fixed long ago by certain inspired writers whose authority is no longer lawful to question. We can't question the authority of Aristotle. We can't question authority of Shakespeare. We can't question authority of Plato. Okay, those were the masters. Those were the pioneers of literary writing. Those were the standard figures there. Those were the writers whom we have to follow there. We can't question them. Okay, it is unlawful to question those writers. So that is the reason we can't change these rules. We can't bring that revolution here in our literature. Okay, that was a point made by Lord Jeffrey. But Keats, John Keats, a romantic poet, he replies Lord Jeffrey. He says, the genius of poetry must work out its own salvation in man. Okay, poetry is man's imagination, it's man's own emotion. How can I write my own emotion with the instruction from Plato, with the instruction from Aristotle? These are my own emotions. These are the things which come from me. Okay, the literature is my own product. It is up to me how I write. Why I need to follow the rules of Aristotle? Why I need to follow the rules of Shakespeare? Those were made 100,000 years back. Okay, genius of poetry is when I write it my own. It gives a salvation to man. Okay, man must be free to write something at his own there. It can't be matured by law and precept. Okay, we can't in a way bound that literature. Here he's talking about poetry, but in generally you can take it for literature as well. We can't in a way bound that literature in rules, in laws. Okay, it can't be in a way written according to those laws made by those ancient masters. It is something emotions and then imagination. It is man's own product. It is individuality. It will come into play. Okay, this which is creative and must create itself. Okay, thing which is creative. If I can create something, it must create itself. If I can make my own rule, I must make it. Okay, so that is something, a reply that was given by Keats to Lord Jeffrey. So this was, in a way, thing. This was a spirit that dominated this romantic age there. Okay, another thing is that, as we discussed there, another name of romantic age is age of Wordsworth, as he was a most prominent writer there. Okay, now coming to the controversy. The controversy that when romantic period starts there. Okay, the controversy when romantic periods start and then when it ends there. The controversy is that some say romantic period starts, the exact date is 1798. Why 1798? They say in 1798 the lyrical ballads were published. Lyrical Ballads is a collection of ballads written by both Coleridge and Wordsworth. Coleridge and Wordsworth uh, Coleridge and Wordsworth collectively wrote lyrical ballads in 17. They were writing that literary ballads since 3, 4, 5 years, but they were published in 1798. So critics say 1790 year marks the start of Romantic age there. So, but some say Romanticism was inspired by French Revolution. So French Revolution took place in 1789. That can be considered as a starting point of Romantic age in England as well, because writers were inspired by French Revolution. Romantic writers, Romantic critics, Romantic literature was inspired by revolution, was inspired by revolt, was inspired by these writers by that French Revolution. So that took place in 1789. So that can be in a way that should be considered a year, the starting year of Romantic age here. But the agreed upon, are in a way not agreed upon, but the mostly accepted and mostly recognized year among the critics for the start of that Romantic age is 1798, the year in which lyrical ballads were published by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. Okay, so lyrical ballads have a deep connection with that Romantic age, with that romanticism there, because that was a very first book which inspired writers, which raised voice against those classical or pseudo classical and new classical strict rules. That was the very first book that raised voice against those things. So it was a book that was in a way unique at that time. It was very much unique. When people saw this book, when they read this book, they were very much inspired by this new thought there. So 1798 can be a starting year of that Romantic age. Uh, Okay, French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars are the major political events that triggered the rise of Romanticism as a literary movement. Okay, Romanticism as a literary movement was on the rise, inspired from French Revolution and then the preceding Napoleonic Wars. Okay, the very much interesting fact here is that the impact of French Revolution on English literature. Okay, there are multiple books in history written on the impact of French Revolution on English literature. There are multiple PhD theses have been done on the topic impact of French Revolution on English literature. So French Revolution deeply impacted the English literature there. So English literature of Romantic period mostly. Okay, that is very much inspired from that French Revolution. The interesting fact is that British writers of this age supported and praised French Revolution. On the other hand, the British kings, the British monarchy, the British prime minister, they were in strictly in opposition to French Revolution, because French Revolution was a challenge to the fixed norms, to the fixed rules. It was a challenge to the authority of kings. It was a challenge to monarchy. It was a challenge to clergy and pope. So that was a reason that political figures, the prime ministers, the kings, and then those who were sitting there in parliament, those who were sitting there in the churches, they strictly opposed French Revolution. They thought if French Revolution took place in France, it can be exported into England as well. People can raise voice against us as well. Kings thought that, so it is preferable to oppose that French Revolution in order to save ourselves here, because revolution can't be in a way strictly limited to one territory. It always exported. Okay, it always comes out of those territories there. It always spreads there. So they were in a way very much in a fear that French Revolution will be exported here in England, and then people will make here another revolution, the English Revolution. They will raise voice against the authority of monarchy and then the kings. So that was a proper reason that British monarchs, the kings and then the prime ministers and then the parliament and church, all, they strictly opposed the French Revolution. But the interesting fact is that the writers, the literary figures, they supported French Revolution. They praised French Revolution. Though there was a rivalry, there was a war between France and England at that time. Napoleon Bonaparte was having a war with England. There were three or four battles between England and then the France at that time. The naval battles and then the land battles as well in the continent. So all those battles on one side, all those rivalry between England and France on one side, all that opposition by kings and monarchs and then clergy of the French Revolution on one side, the writers of the Romantic period, they stood in opposition to all this their society. They supported French Revolution. They supported the ideals of French Revolution. They praised it. So that was a very much interesting fact here. So the writers were in opposition to kings and monarchs at that time, the Romantic writers. That is the reason we say Romantic writers revolted not only against classical rules, not only against classical masters, but also against the politics of that time, but also against the monarchs and the kings of those time, and they did not go unpunished. Okay, they were severely persecuted as well. They were forced to migrate from their lands by the governments, by the monarchs, because they were supporting the French Revolution. Okay, that was a spirit behind that Romantic age. That was, in a way, triggering factor behind this romanticism and then this romantic age there. Um, so in addition to it, inspiration from people's craving for freedom. People wanted freedom, freedom from monarchs, and then freedom from those strict literary rules as well. So they both things go hand in hand. Okay, the politics and then the literature. Okay, insistence upon individuality and then the spirit of raising voice against tyranny of older order. The old order in literature, old order in politics, both. Okay, so